About 1 in 10 people on Earth has blue eyes. Brown eyes are full of melanin. Green and hazel eyes have less of it, but blue is not a pigment at all. There is no blue dye anywhere in a human iris. The color is a trick of light. Light scattering through tissue that holds almost no pigment. So if the body does not actually make the color blue, where did it come from? The answer the scientists landed on is harder to accept than the question. It came from one person. A single human being, alive somewhere between 6 and 10,000 years ago. Today we are going to trace that one person. We are going to follow a single change in the DNA from the body it first appeared in, through 10,000 years of human history, into more than 500 million pairs of eyes alive right now. And we are going to sit with the part almost nobody talks about. Because by every rule of how traits pass down, this trait should have vanished within a few generations and left no record that it ever happened. It didn't. If you are interested in ancient mysteries and how they connect to modern DNA research, hit subscribe. We cover forgotten history and gene discoveries every week. But this story does not start in a gene lab. It starts with a much older question, one that has nothing to do with family trees. It starts with why anyone has eye color at all. The colored ring around your pupil is called the iris. It is not a flat disc of paint. It is a layered piece of muscle and tissue, and its job is about doing work, not about looks. It opens and closes to control how much light reaches the back of your eye. The color is a side effect of how that tissue is built. The front layer of the iris holds cells that can carry a pigment called melanin, the same pigment that colors your skin and hair. The more melanin packed into those cells, the more light gets soaked up before it can bounce back out. An iris packed with pigment soaks up almost everything. It looks deep brown, sometimes nearly black. That is the normal setting for our kind. For most of human history, every single person on Earth had brown eyes. Now take the melanin away. Strip it down to almost nothing. The tissue underneath does not become blue because there is no blue stuff to show. Instead, something stranger happens. Light enters the iris, hits the colorless fibers inside it, and scatters. The shorter wavelengths, the blue end of the light, scatter back toward the viewer more than the longer red ones do. The exact same physics turns the daytime sky blue. There is no blue dye in the sky either. So a blue eye is not an eye that contains blue. It is an eye that has been emptied of brown, and the emptiness scatters light. Green and hazel eyes sit in the middle, a small amount of melanin layered over that same scattering effect. This matters because it tells you what kind of change we are looking for. Nobody needed to invent a blue pigment. The trait does not need a new ingredient. It only needs to switch the old one off. And switching something off is a much smaller change in the genes than building something new. It is the difference between designing a lamp and simply turning the lamp's dimmer all the way down. For decades, scientists thought they knew which dimmer it was. There is a gene called OCA2. It carries the instructions for a protein that helps make and move melanin inside cells. When OCA2 is badly broken, the result is a form of albinism, almost no pigment anywhere in the body. So the thinking seemed obvious. Eye color is about melanin. OCA2 controls melanin, so blue eyes must come from changes inside OCA2 itself. For years, that was the accepted idea. It was also wrong. Here's the detail everyone missed. When scientists actually read the OCA2 gene in blue-eyed people, the gene itself was whole. The instructions for the protein were fine. The blue-eyed and the brown-eyed were carrying the same working OCA2. Whatever was dimming the melanin, it was not damage to the gene. It was something controlling the gene from the outside. A genome is not just a list of genes. It is also full of switches. Stretches of DNA that do not code for any protein but instead decide when nearby genes turn on, how strongly, and in which body parts. Scientists call these control switches. They are the dimmers and timers of the genome. And the switch for OCA2 does not sit inside OCA2. It sits inside a completely different, much bigger gene next door called HERK2. Buried deep within HERK2, in a part that does not code for any protein, there is a tiny control switch that reaches over and decides how loudly OCA2 speaks inside the cells of the iris. In most people, that switch holds OCA2 at full volume. Plenty of melanin, brown eyes. But in some people, a single letter of DNA at that exact spot has been changed. One base, out of more than 3 billion in the human genome. That one change weakens the switch. OCA2 still works, but in the iris it gets turned down low. Less melanin. Light scatters. Blue eyes. That single letter change has a name. Scientists label it RS12913832. it does not break the gene, and it does not cause disease. It simply weakens a switch, 21,000 letters up the strand from the gene that switch controls. And that one weakened switch is the reason blue eyes exist on this planet. Which brings us to the study that turned an odd little fact into something truly strange. In 2008, a research team at the University of Copenhagen set out to pin this down for good. The work was led by a gene scientist named Hans Eiberg, who had spent years studying the genes behind eye color. His team gathered DNA from blue-eyed people, and they did not stay inside Denmark to do it. They collected samples from Denmark, from Turkey, and from Jordan, Northern Europe, Anatolia, and the Near East. 3 groups of people separated by thousands of miles, by language, by religion, by thousands of years of history. If blue eyes had appeared more than once, this is exactly where you would expect to see it. Different groups finding their own path to the same trait. The dimmer switch flipped by different letters, different mutations, arriving at roughly the same result. That is how a lot of traits work. Lighter skin, for example, developed through more than one genetic path in more than one part of the world. So the sensible guess going in was variety. Several versions of a blue eye change scattered across these distant groups. That is not what they found. Every blue-eyed person in the study, in all 3 countries, carried the same change at RS129, 13832. Not a similar change, the same one. And it did not stop there. The DNA right around that switch was also exactly the same, a long shared stretch of genetic neighborhood that traveled with the mutation everywhere it went. Scientists call that shared stretch a haplotype. And a shared haplotype is not an accident, it is a fingerprint. It means the mutation was not flipped on its own in Denmark, and again in Jordan, and again in Turkey. It was flipped once, in one person, and every blue-eyed human being is carrying a copy of that first event. That is not a typo, by the way. Out of every blue-eyed person ever tested, in study after study in the years since, the founder mutation keeps coming back as one thing passed down from a single source. Eiberg's own answer was plain. Blue eyes go back to one shared ancestor. One person, somewhere between 6 and 10,000 years ago, in whose body that switch flipped for the first time. So we have our person, a single human deep in the distant past, the first blue-eyed person who ever lived. And what comes next is the part that still does not fully make sense. The part where this stops being a neat genetics result and turns into something close to impossible. Think about what that one person actually was. A single person in a small, ancient village. The mutation existed, at that moment, in exactly one body, on one copy of one chromosome. Now look at the odds the way a scientist who studies how traits spread would. A brand new mutation, carried by just one person, has a scary habit of simply disappearing. The person might have no children. They might have children who do not get that one copy, because each child gets only one of the parents' 2 chromosomes, a coin flip every time. Disease, accident, a bad winter, a raid, any of it ends the line. The math of new mutations is unforgiving. Almost all of them are gone within a handful of generations, wiped out by nothing more than plain chance. And blue eyes had an extra problem stacked on top. The trait is recessive. To actually have blue eyes, you need 2 copies of the change, one from each parent. Our founder had exactly 1 copy. So the founder did not have blue eyes. Neither did their children. Neither almost certainly did their grandchildren. For generations, the mutation traveled completely unseen, hidden inside brown-eyed carriers, making no blue eyes at all, giving natural selection nothing to act on, nothing to protect it, nothing to push it forward. It was a silent passenger with every reason to fall off the train. A trait like that, by the numbers, should not be here. It should be one of the countless mutations that flickered to life in one Stone Age body and went out again without leaving a mark. The honest scientific view is that the most likely result, by far, was nothing. No blue eyes, no inheritance at all. The trait that almost never existed. But it did exist. It is sitting in about 1 in 10 faces on the planet. So the real question is not what blue eyes are. We have answered that. The real question is, what carried this fragile, hidden, long-shot mutation through 10,000 years of human history? And to even begin answering that, scientists needed to find out where the founder lived. Which meant they needed older proof than any living person could give them. They needed the long-buried. Enter ancient DNA. In the last 15 years, it became possible to pull out and read genetic material from human remains thousands of years old. Bone, especially the thick bone of the inner ear, can keep pieces of a person's genome long after everything else about them is gone. And once scientists could read the genomes of people long gone, they could ask a question no living sample could answer. They could ask when the blue eye switch first shows up in the record, and in whom. The answer came out of a cave in northern Spain called La Braña. Inside, scientists dug up the skeleton of a man who lived roughly 7,000 years ago, a hunter-gatherer from a Europe that existed before farming had spread across it. When his genome was read and published in 2014, it broke a belief that had held for a very long time. Picture an ancient European, and you probably imagine someone pale. The La Braña man was not. His genome carried the gene versions for dark skin and dark hair. He would have looked, in skin tone, nothing like the people who live in Spain today. But his eyes carried the changed version of the HERK2 switch. Dark skin, dark hair, and blue eyes in one face 7,000 years ago. For a long time, scientists had believed pale skin and pale eyes arrived in Europe together, as a single late package. La Braña man proved that wrong in a single skeleton. The blue eye switch was already spreading thousands of years before light skin became common. The founder had lived, and the mutation had already begun its quiet spread, long before Europe looked anything like it does today. And he was not alone. A man whose remains were found at Lachspor in Luxembourg lived around 8,000 years ago. Same story. A Stone Age hunter-gatherer carrying the blue eye version. Across Stone Age Europe in scattered hunter-gatherer groups, the switch was already there, already moving, still mostly hidden inside carriers, waiting. Most people never heard about the strangest case of all. In a cave in southwest England, scientists found the remains of a man who lived around 10,000 years ago. He is known as Cheddar Man, after the gorge where he was found, and he is the oldest, almost complete skeleton ever found in Britain. In 2018, a team pulled DNA from the thick bone of his skull and tested it for color. The face they built from that work showed a man with dark skin, dark curly hair, and light eyes, probably blue or green. The oldest Briton on record, and the founder's switch was already in him. 10,000 years ago, on an island, at the far western edge of the lived-in world, a man was already carrying a copy of a mutation that, going by the gene evidence, had begun life in one body somewhere far to the east. The trait had already crossed a continent before recorded history began. It had already traveled further than most people in that age would ever travel in a lifetime, and it had done it while staying almost completely unseen. This is the part of the story that pulls in everything else this channel covers. Because the trail does not point to Western Europe as the place it started. It points east. If you want to keep following stories like this one, where modern DNA cracks open a piece of the ancient world, take a second to subscribe. It really helps the channel, and it means the next deep dive lands in front of you. Now, back to the question of where this person actually lived. The clue is in the spread itself. The mutation turns up in ancient hunter-gatherers across Europe, but it also shows up then and now in groups across the Near East, the Caucasus, and the lands around the Black Sea. Iberg, looking at how the trait was spread out, suggested the founder most likely lived somewhere in that wider region, in the broad zone north and east of the Mediterranean, around the time people there were starting to change how they lived. That timing is not a small detail. Between roughly 10,000 and 6,000 years ago, the Near East and the lands around the Black Sea were the engine room of the human story. This was where farming took hold, where the first crowded, lasting settlements grew, where groups of people stopped being thin and scattered and started being large, connected, and on the move. The Sumerians, the people this channel returns to again and again, would rise in the southern part of that same broad world not long after. The founder of every blue eye did not live in some empty corner of the distant past. They lived, as far as the genes can tell us, in the same restless, growing, deeply connected region that produced the first cities humanity ever built. And that, finally, is what answers the impossible part. A fragile, recessive mutation, hidden inside carriers, with no help from natural selection, needs one thing above all else to survive. It needs to be inside a group that is growing and spreading rather than shrinking and dying. A mutation in a small, cut-off, shrinking group gets buried with that group. A mutation in a group that is growing fast and pushing outward, starting new settlements, sending people in every direction, gets carried along for the ride. Every new village is a new lottery ticket. Every move is another chance for two hidden carriers to finally meet, have children, and produce the first blue-eyed faces the world had ever seen. The founder happened to be standing, in terms of his genes, at exactly the right place at exactly the right moment in human history. The trait itself was not useful. There is no strong proof that blue eyes ever gave anyone a better chance to survive. What mattered was the group carrying it, which was about to do something no group of humans had ever done before. It was about to multiply and spread across a continent. Later movements did the rest. Waves of people moving out of that eastern heartland, including the great movements off the grasslands several thousand years ago, swept across Europe and reshaped where its people came from. The blue-eye switch rode along inside them. And in the cooler, paler groups of northern and eastern Europe, where carriers became common enough to regularly meet and pair up, the hidden trait finally broke through in force. Today, in countries like Estonia, blue eyes are not unusual. They are the clear majority. A trait that started in one body became the usual face of a whole region. It is worth being clear about what it really took for that trait to show up, because that is the quiet heart of the whole story. A recessive trait only gets seen when two carriers have a child together and that child draws the hidden copy from both sides. In a small, thinly spread group, two carriers might live out their whole lives 100 miles apart and never meet. The mutation can sit inside a group for 1,000 years and produce almost no blue eyes at all. What changes the math is crowding and contact. More people, packed closer, moving more, marrying across villages. Every one of those things describes what was happening in and around the Near East as farming spread and the number of people grew. The founder's switch survived for one reason only. The human world, right at that moment, was turning into the kind of crowded, connected place where a hidden recessive trait finally gets enough rolls of the dice to show its face. Everything was in place for blue eyes to appear. It just took thousands of years for the world to get crowded enough to notice. There is one more layer of proof, and it is the layer that makes this hard to argue with. A single study can be doubted. One skeleton can be called a fluke. But the founder mutation has now been checked, and checked again, against group after group, against ancient genome after ancient genome, for well over 10 years. And the result has never broken. The same switch, the same shared haplotype around it, the same single starting point. No second blue-eye mutation made on its own has ever turned up and held. In a field where almost everything gets changed, this one finding has stayed exactly where Iberg's team left it in 2008. Which leaves us with an idea that sounds like magic but is really just genetics. Every blue-eyed person who has ever lived, your blue-eyed friend, your blue-eyed parent, the blue-eyed stranger across the train, is connected. Not loosely, not as a figure of speech. They are all carrying a real copy of a single mutation that happened in a single cell, in a single person, in a single generation, somewhere in the ancient Near East. They are, in the truest sense of the word, one big family. A bloodline 10,000 years deep, spread across continents, most of its members complete strangers to each other, all of them tracing back to one person nobody can name. We will probably never know who that person was. There is no skeleton labeled Patient Zero, no grave, no name, no face. The founder is hidden in every way except one. They left their switch in more than 500 million living eyes, and every one of those eyes is still doing the same thing the founders did. Scattering light through tissue that was quietly emptied of brown 10,000 years ago, by a change that, by every rule we know, should never have lasted the week. It did, and it is looking back at you from the mirror, or it isn't, and either way the reason traces to one ancient morning and one person whose name is gone forever. The trait that almost never existed became one of the best-known features on the human face. It got there on luck alone, in the right place, at the right time, in the right crowd. The night sky is blue for the same reason your neighbor's eyes are. No pigment, just light, scattering, and a very long family line. If DNA mysteries like this are your thing, you need to see what we are covering next. The ancient DNA result that suggests 3 so-called separate civilizations were the same people all along. Click the video on screen now.